Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches, and this is part 3 of my 3-part series in how Omega could rise to challenge, even pass Rolex as the king of Swiss watches. That is, selling the most watches for the most money year on year. So far I've discussed why I think Swatch should bother, and I've also discussed why I think Omega could potentially do it. In this video I talk about how they could do it. The video is too long, and so I'm not going to talk anymore. See you on the other side of the intro and we'll get straight into it. Okay, so let's get into how Omega could catch and potentially even pass Rolex as the biggest Swiss watch brand in terms of value of sales, Swiss francs brought in at the end of every year. Basically, this means selling more watches and selling more expensive watches. Get out of your mind any idea that there's reputation or kudos or gravitas or style points in this. This is weightlifting. Who can lift the heaviest weight? Not some kind of bullshit rhythmic gymnastics where there's style points. Got to keep our eye on the numbers. Every strategy has to feed into how can you sell more watches and how can you sell more expensive watches. Now, a lot of people will immediately go to Rolex as an exemplar. They are the king of the hill right now. I'm going to do exactly the same thing. However, in doing so, I think we need to check some assumptions and some ground rules. The first is to realize that yesterday wasn't like today. Rolex hasn't always been the colossus that they are now. To understand Rolex, you need to look at their full 100 years of history, not what they've done over the last 2 or 3. If you do look at the last 100 years of history, what you'll see is that Rolex is fundamentally about survival, not growth. They got to where they are because at that critical moment, that critical juncture of watch history in the early 70s following the quartz crisis, they were the last man standing. All of their competitors allowed themselves to die, and Rolex did not. And that has been the launching pad for them to get to the top, and they have spent the next 50 years defending that hill. Once you understand that, there's a couple of things that become clear. One, following a defensive strategy like Rolex has got will lock Omega or any other watch company into permanent second place. Rolex is not going to fail. They know what they're doing. They have a solid game plan and they are disciplined about maintaining it. They are not going to do you the favor of killing themselves. Omega or any other brand that wants to catch and pass Rolex must be focused on growth and must actively seek to pass them. And in doing so, what you need to, when you're learning from Rolex, not only do you have to carefully filter out those actions which are defensive strategies, you also need to be careful about understanding which of Rolex's behaviors are outcomes of being on top rather than causes of being on top. What are the things that Rolex does that have moved them away versus what are the things Rolex does because they've moved away from the rest of the pack? And I think a lot of people don't think of it that way, and they advocate for brands to do things like Rolex that really will do nothing much to help their growth. Okay, so all of that preamble done, let's get into some key areas where I believe Rolex has done an amazing job to put themselves on top, and in those same areas where I think Omega is kind of weak and needs to do better. The first is around corporate identity. From the very moment that Hans Wilsdorf closed his old Wilsdorf and Davis company and recreated this new chimera called Rolex, he has had a very clear idea of what it's about. Originally, that was about just having really reliable, dependable, predictable quality. That's what Rolex was that's their core value, their core identity. Subsequent to that, they have layered on a second part of that identity, which is about wealth, power, status, success, what I'm going to call exclusive luxury. So Rolex now, we know exactly what they are: solid, predictable quality and exclusive luxury. Now, when I think about Omega, I'm not so sure. If I try and think about how would I define Omega, I end up with the Moon, James Bond, the Seamaster, the Speedmaster, and we're not Rolex. There is some talk of innovation on the Omega website. We see some actions like the Ultra series that they did a couple of years ago, but nothing seems followed through. It's really difficult to figure out what does Omega stand for. And we need to fix that. They need to decide what their corporate identity is and then get that out there and fix it in people's minds. The first thing I would say is you're not going to be able to out Rolex. Rolex knows who they are. They've been doing this for 100 years. We know who they are. They are this idea of predictable quality and exclusive luxury, at least in the price range that's going to get you to the top of the hill. I think the idea of not being Rolex is actually useful. I would suggest that for Omega. I think a corporate identity based around unrelenting innovation and inclusive luxury would be a really smart way to go. What do I mean by unrelenting innovation? Always something new, always developing and taking us places. See what you've done with the Ultra series and continue that through. Continue to give us new materials, new looks, new escapements, new whatever. And also where I talk about inclusive versus exclusive luxury, with exclusive luxury like like Rolex has gone, it's all about making the brand the most important thing and making the customer feel good because they've got something no one else can have, making the customer feel good because they've managed to crawl over the broken glass and get to the golden ring that has been dangled in front of them by the watch company. I think with inclusive luxury, you turn it around the other way. You make the customer the center of the circle. The customer is the one that you are trying to give a luxurious experience to. It's the customer that you're trying to make happy. You want them happy not because they've managed to survive beating their head against a brick wall for 6 months and finally got their watch. You want them happy because they've just got the watch they want. That's where I'd be aiming if I was Omega. Unrelenting innovation and inclusive luxury. Next, the Omega has a problem with quality. They need to stop cost cutting. Now, as I've said already, you're not going to push Rolex off the top of the hill as the king of predictable quality. They've been doing that for 100 years. They own that. Omega doesn't need to be the market leader. They don't need to be better than Rolex, but they've got to reduce the noise. They've got to cut out the obvious complaints that you're hearing on YouTube about things like, poor case finishing, poor clasp designs, bracelet design and finishing, that sort of thing. Just clean that stuff up. If it means bringing it in-house, bring it in-house. If it means finding better suppliers, find better suppliers. Here's the thing though, pass on the cost. Don't get so hung up on being cheap. We have to make the watches more expensive anyway for us to get to the top of the hill. So pass on the cost, raise the quality, and make the customer pay for it. Okay, the next thing is the catalog. There's a myth going around that Rolex has this very tight catalog with very few SKUs, very few watches, and it is a total myth. If you do actually walk up to an enthusiast and say, name me a couple of Rolex watches, they'll instantly go Submariner, Sea Dweller, GMT Master, Milgauss, Air King, OP, Datejust, Day Date. All of these names, and that's probably half of them. All of these names we know. All of these are handholds for enthusiasts and other people to grab hold of in trying to understand and connect with your brand. If you do the same with Omega, there's two, Seamaster and Speedmaster. Some people will remember the Constellation. Some people will remember the DeVille, but that will be few and far between. The whole Omega catalogue is far too narrow and far too deep. My favourite best bad example is having a watch called the Railmaster buried under 3 levels of dive watches. I know the Omega catalogue is a result of history, and some people are going to be really uncomfortable about giving that up, but a strong brand has to be able to grow from its history, not be confined by it. And right now, Omega's historic catalogue is a cage locking it in. What I'd suggest is obvious. The Speedmaster line needs to be broken up. I'd be thinking something like we keep the Speedmaster, but then come up with a new racing line, maybe an instrument line. Take that 38 series, which are the more dressy ones, reintroduce that as a separate line, call it the Cosmic line, and let that grow into kind of dressy, complicated watches. Same thing with the Seamaster line. Yeah, keep the Seamaster, but take Planet Ocean, bring it out. Take Aquaterra, bring it out. Then you've still got the DeVille and the Constellation, keep them. So if you got to the point 10 years from now when you walked up to an enthusiast and said, name me some Omega lines, if they said Speedmaster, Racing, Instrument, Seamaster, Planet Ocean, Aquaterra, DeVille, that's gold. You've given enthusiasts and collectors so many, and just plain old everyday normal people, more handholds to grab hold of when they're trying to understand, describe, and choose to buy an Omega watch. The other issue too is you're strengthening what it means to be a Speedmaster. You're strengthening what it means to be an Aquaterra or a Seamaster. At the moment, what you've got is this kind of dilution of what is a Speedmaster or what is a Seamaster across a vast array of different styles and types. And that dilutes those brands, not strengthens them. Which really brings me to the next point, which I know a lot of you are going to be saying when we talk about catalogue, that they've got to cut down on the limited editions, etc. I don't believe they should. First, remember the name of the game. Sell more watches, sell more expensive watches. Limited editions sell. It's not about style points, it's about sell. And limited editions work that way. But one of the benefits of opening up the catalogue, broadening it, is you can have just as many real limited editions, but far less apparent editions. At the moment, it feels like every second day there's a Speedmaster or a Seamaster limited edition, and that's because there is every second day and either a Speedmaster or a Seamaster. By opening up the catalogue, it becomes a Speedmaster, then a Racing, then an Instrument, then a Cosmic, then a Seamaster, then a Planet Ocean, then an Aquaterra, then a DeVille, then a Constellation, and roll it around. You don't get that same sense of this unending list of just Speedmasters and Seamasters. The next point a lot of you have raised in comments is that Omega should get rid of the quartz watches out of its collection, that somehow cheapens the brand. I would disagree with that strongly. You cannot pretend that you are interested in horological innovation and not have quartz in your collection. You cannot pretend that you are interested in making serious watches for actual serious people that do real things in the 21st century and not have quartz in your collection. I think they have to keep quartz in the collection. It has to be managed very carefully. It has to be built into the identity of unrelenting innovation, and that this is the kind of watch that a fighter pilot actually would strap onto their wrist, a person going to space would actually strap onto their wrist. And to do that, you have to have quartz in a collection. Bugger it, you know what? In the future, this might even mean Omega would start introducing some kind of smartwatch. I have no idea what that would look like or how or whether it would work, but I'm saying right now, I would not take that off the table. Okay, the next thing that Omega needs to worry about and learn from Rolex is about distribution discipline. I heard a quote recently that, the perfect number of things to make is the exact number that the community wants to buy minus one. And I couldn't agree more with that. I think that's absolutely right. Omega has in the past made the mistake of massively overestimating, having far too much inventory in the sphere, and then resulted in dumping, loss of prices, expectation of discounts, blah, blah, blah. And in a world where what we're trying to do is maximize the number and price of the watches you sell, that is a way to lose. What Omega needs to do is invest a lot more in understanding how many watches it needs to make and then making just that many. They've got to find a way to find and stay in that sweet spot. When in doubt, it is better to not have a watch available than to have too many watches available. That said, there is something you can learn from Rolex right now as well, which is waitlists are okay, but if the waitlist becomes unpredictable, if it's not even certain that there is actually a waitlist, that you may or may not even get that watch, that in itself is another kind of problem. And that's a problem Rolex is running into right now. So you can avoid one of their pitfalls. There's the internet is full of people who are just really tired of the games associated with having to get hold of a Rolex. That is something you never want to be. You never want in your distribution model to be making people think that they have to play a game. That is exclusive, not inclusive. And that is something you should never allow to happen with your distribution. The easiest way to do that, by the way, is for Omega to move away from independent ADs and increase their use of company boutiques and online sales, which is something I would recommend they do. If you're reliant on independent ADs, you have given up control of much of your distribution system. If you can increase your use of company boutiques and online sales, then you own that whole distribution network, and it's much easier to finely tune your distribution to make sure that you're staying in that sweet spot of not quite enough watches, but at the same time, just enough watches. Okay, so that's distribution discipline. Now let's talk about marketing. The first thing is there's just got to be more. Industry experts estimate that Rolex spends something like 40% of its annual turnover on marketing. Swatch Group is estimated to spend something like 20 to 25%. Do the numbers for Rolex and Omega, and that means it's likely, we can't know exactly, but it's likely in any given year, Rolex spends 4 to 8 times what Omega does. That means Omega simply needs to spend more. That said, they're never going to match Rolex, so they've got to be careful about how they do it. Now let's talk some more detail about how they should really structure that marketing. The first is, and another lesson that they can learn from Rolex, is it's got to be more brand focused and it's got to reach people before they've even thought they're going to buy a watch. Rolex's power has come from the fact that everyone in the world, whether they know watches or not, they knows Rolex. They might not even know that Rolex makes watches, but they just know the name. It is a name associated with luxury. Omega is not like that. Omega is kind of the next level down. You have to be at least in the watch world a bit to know that they exist and that they're important. Omega needs to get out of that space, and they need to be getting to people and getting their name in front of people before they've even decided they need to buy a watch. Okay, so now that's the very general stuff. Now let's start getting down and getting a little bit more detailed. Generally, right now, Omega's marketing is based around the 3 S's: space, sports, and spies. And I think that works pretty well. I'd probably keep doing that. It doesn't land particularly well with women, I fear, but we'll talk about that a bit later. I think that can work out. Okay, start off, we'll talk about space. They've got NASA, and that works really well for them. I wonder if I worry that Omega has no connection with SpaceX, and I think that's probably worth chasing. I think there's also no requirement for Omega to lock itself into the United States. It is, after all, a Swiss company. So I'd love to see them hook up with, say, the Indian Space Research Organization or the European Space Agency and get their name against every little ticker for every launch that those guys do and put up on YouTube. I also think that the moon is great, but all of that dies the second a man puts his foot on Mars. Omega I don't hear anything about them being associated with the Mars missions, and I think that is something that they have to address and get involved in. I also think that Omega needs to step away from being just involved in real life, and they need to become the watch of fictional space as well. This is where it's going to get controversial, I suspect. I think that one of the great advantages of Rolex is there's no dilution of their marketing budget, whereas there is within the Swatch group. If Swatch wants to put Omega on top, they need to clear the ground. And that means telling brands like Hamilton that they don't get to be in space movies. That if there's going to be an astronaut, that astronaut is going to be wearing an Omega. If this has got to do with innovation, the future, moving forward, then this is going to be an Omega watch that character is wearing, not a Hamilton. Okay, so that's space. Now let's talk about sports. I think this is a tricky one. You've got to find this nice balance between kind of wealthy sports but not aristocratic sports. What do I mean? Cycling, running, Formula One, golf are all wealthy sports, but they're not aristocratic. They're not elitist. They're not exclusive, like, for example, sailing or equestrian might be. So I would suggest, first off, wealthy sports good, aristocratic sports bad, and that means specifically for Omega, get the hell out of sailing. Okay, so what sports would I do? Okay, before I get into that, one other thing. Omega has to be very careful that it never markets in a place where it's always going to be seen as the second best. And unfortunately, that means some of the sports I just listed are out. You cannot compete with Rolex and be shown to lose. And that means Omega cannot advertise in Formula One, it cannot advertise in golf, and it cannot advertise in tennis, because Rolex owns the majors. They owned the Grand Slams, and they own all the best property in Formula One. You've got to find somewhere else to go. The Olympics are great. Omega owns that, and that's a fantastic base to work from. It doesn't happen often enough, so they're going to have to find other avenues. You can target the kinds of sports that turn up in the Olympics would be good places for Omega to go to. And here's another case where Swatch Group needs to clear the field and give Omega a clear run at this. The idea that Tissot is a naming sponsor for a global event like the Tour de France makes zero sense. Get Tissot out of there and have Omega all over events like that. When we talk about spies, well, James Bond is great, but he's not enough. If Omega, if the Swatch Group can find a Bollywood equivalent, jump in there, boots and all, and establish an Indian version of James Bond. If there is a Chinese equivalent, jump in there and own it so that you cover the globe and not just the English-speaking West. Be willing to get off the big screen and onto TV. The future is things like Netflix, Hulu, etc. Be comfortable with the idea of finding the next big spy thing there and having them wear Omegas all the time. Now, just as I did with the catalog issue and limited editions and quartz, I strongly suspect that right now many of you are gagging on the idea of this whole relying on fictional people to sell watches. It doesn't feel right to you, it feels juvenile to you, and it feels like it cheapens the brand. Again, I would stress, the name of the game is winning, and you win by selling more watches. And every single piece of research Omega has done has shown that sales across the board surge every time there is a Bond related issue here, every time that there is a new Bond movie, their numbers all go north. That is absolutely normal and predictable. It is why we feel it's all bound up with what's called, if you want to do the research, it's all bound up with what we call parasocial relationships. And it's a very normal human thing that we form kind of one-way relationships with fictional and historical characters. It's why we feel bad at the end of long books where we sort of feel like we're saying goodbye to characters, that sort of thing. You might not like it. You might think it's juvenile. It doesn't matter what you like. It doesn't matter what you think. It sells watches, and Omega needs to do it. Okay, so the last thing that I think Omega can learn from Rolex and has to harness themselves is how to harness social media and have that hype explosion that Rolex has experienced over the last couple of years. Now, the first thing is, this is actually most interesting because Rolex hasn't been an active player in this. Rolex, Omega, and pretty much every other Swiss watch brand have actually been incredibly passive in the social media world. They have almost ignored the internet, it sometimes feels like. What they have, in fact, what most brands have done is entirely relied upon their community to do that. They've relied upon their buyers, their owners to do that work for them. And this has been an abject failure for every single brand bar one, which was Rolex. Rolex did nothing. They skated along relying on their community. But here's the thing. They had a huge and active and militant, almost cult-like community driving them through social media. And the way social media works with the idea of social proofing and normative behaviors means that that lead has been hypercharged and has taken Rolex from being like 14% of the market to 24% of the market in about 10 years. That reliance on community has been and will be a failure for every other watch brand. Relying on the community will only work for the market leader. And since Omega is not the market leader, it can't do that. The good news is, though, this is not over, that this is not done. Smaller brands like Oris within the mainstream and perhaps Zelos and the other micro brands have shown that brands can actively intervene and support and take over and drive the community and achieve results in awareness and customer feeling far beyond what their footprint might normally, what their sales footprint would normally support. That's something that Swatch Group in general and Omega needs to do. They need to copy Oris and say, we are going to, or Norcane, or a whole bunch of these smaller, Formex are doing it now. Omega needs to think, we're going to learn from Omega, we're going to learn from Oris, we're going to learn from Norcane, we're going to learn from Formex, and we are going to drive our community through social media, not the other way round. I think if they do that, hire some experts, get some people in who know what they're doing, then I think that they could potentially get there. Okay, so that's all the things I think that Omega could learn from Rolex. There are, however, two other things that I would like to see the Swatch Group do that are unique to them, that aren't things that Rolex do, but things that the Swatch Group could. And the first is the Swatch Group needs to hunt Omega as a pack. They need to realize that they can sometimes, a pack of hyenas can take out a much larger lion. And that's what the situation we've got here. Now, I've said before that Omega shouldn't try to out Rolex, that they shouldn't try to compete in that kind of exclusive luxury space. That doesn't mean that Swatch Group shouldn't have a go there anyway. I think Swatch Group should set Blancpain and Glasuta Original and Breguet targets designed to take market share off Rolex. They should be sitting down to Blancpain and saying it is not good enough that people are willing to spend Blancpain money on a mere Submariner. You need to stop that, and you need to set sales targets for Blancpain and Gorsut Original and Breguet and Harry Winston, and chip away at the top end of money that people are spending on Rolexes. I have no intention to put Blancpain on top. I have no intention to put Gorsut Original on top. I don't think it's going to happen anyway. The idea is not for Blancpain to kill Rolex. The idea is for Blancpain to knock 2%, 3%, 4% off Rolex's dominance to make them an easier kill for Omega next down the line. The next thing that the Swatch Group needs to do is focus on trying to shift the market from Rolex's strengths. Rolex's strengths is sports watches. Frankly, for many of their core constituency, the Rolex dress watches, like the Cellinis, are an embarrassment. Rolex does not want to be fighting you in that space. One of the things I'd point out to people is, you know how everyone goes nuts for bacon? Well, that's not an accident. An industry group put in place over a long term a number of strategies to push customer tastes towards bacon. And the same is true of salted caramel and a whole bunch of other foods. Don't get trapped by thinking that the market wants what the market wants and you have to follow the market. The market wants what it is led to want. And the Swatch Group has done nothing that I can see to try and shift what the market wants into their strengths. I said earlier that, we kind of ignore the Constellation and DeVille lines from Omega, which is a shame because they are great lines. And what's actually really interesting is, whereas much of the media and the community is kind of ambivalent or don't care at all about the Rolex dress collection, like if a new Cellini comes out, virtually no one will cover it. But new DeVille, a new Constellation comes out, and we are all over it. It gets an enormous amount of coverage. That's a potential strength area for Omega. Swatch needs to be using all of its power, all of its brands, to shift the needle just a little bit. Again, it's like what I said with Blancpain. I'm not talking about totally moving everything and now making dress watches the thing, but rather just shifting the needle, taking a few percentage points off what it is that Rolex is making at the moment, say 24%. If you can drag that down a few more percentage points. So across the board, when Swatch is hunting Rolex as a pack, they're not trying to put Blancpain or Jacques Dro above Rolex. They're always keeping focused on having Omega be the champion, be the guy that makes the killing blow. But instead, what they're trying to do is make sure that instead of trying to chase Rolex at 24, 25% of the market, they want to drag that down to like 16, 17% of the market and make it a much easier kill for Omega. Okay, so that's it. That's what I think Omega and Swatch Group have to do if they want to place Omega in front of Rolex as the biggest selling Swiss watch company. That requires a full court press, as they say, from Swatch Group. Yes, Omega needs to do a lot, but it needs to be given a lot of support by the Swatch Group for other companies to get out of the way, and also for other companies to do things that would help put Omega in the position to deal the killing blow. Does Swatch have that? Oh, and I should also say they need to do this consistently for 10 to 15 years. Now, does Swatch have that kind of commitment and vision and desire? I almost certainly think they don't. Nothing I've ever seen, frankly, from any of the big watch groups, LVMH, Richemont, or Swatch, gives me the impression that they have that kind of drive. I think that they're making money, they're doing okay, they're all fairly comfortable. Most of them are probably not motivated to make this kind of program. So this whole thing is probably a bit of an intellectual exercise, unlikely to ever to actually see the light of day. Still, we're hobbyists, we're enthusiasts, and playing these kind of intellectual games is what we do. If you've got ideas for what you would do, if you disagree with me, agree with me, think that something else needs to be done, put it in the comments below. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches, and I'll see you later. Bye.